The topic of grammar plays a huge role in the debate between classic study and input-based learning. When it comes to grammar study, it ranges from don't touch it even with a 10-foot pole and leave everything to immersion, to you have to memorize 10 grammar books from the first to the last page and be able to explain it all with the correct linguistic terminology. Today, we will talk about what our views are on the topic. It is also important to mention that when we say grammar study, we specifically refer to an activity with the goal of increasing your understanding of grammar. So a separate activity from your immersion. The grammar study itself can take different forms. When most people, and myself included, hear the utterance grammar study, we associate it with working through grammar books, doing grammar exercises, and memorizing conjugation charts, and so on. But that's not the only form grammar study can take. An even stricter form would be to include the study of the accompanying linguistic knowledge. Like in the case of Japanese, wa is called a binding particle and ga is called a case particle. And yes, I had to look through one of the 10,000 posts on Reddit's Learn Japanese forum that talk about wa versus ga to find this example. In our view, this type of deep knowledge isn't necessary. People can easily end up with their head more in their books, in grammar tables and memorizing conjugations than in input material in their target language. And in the end, once you open your first novel, you will still be unable to follow it. This doesn't mean that if you already have the knowledge of the linguistic terms at that level, that it wouldn't be useful to understand your target language, but simply that the understanding of the linguistic terminology and the grammar in the way a linguist does is not necessary. So what about the opposite extreme, the no grammar at all group? There are people who say that you can pick up grammar just from exposure to the language, even at the beginner stage. This theory works, as with enough exposure, eventually you will pick it up. This becomes obvious at a higher level, where you can quite often pick up new words and grammar just from context. But we don't start out as advanced learners. So the question becomes, how long does it take to pick up a grammar point just from exposure if you're a beginner? What is going to be fast? Seeing a grammar point 50 times or more before it finally clicks, or doing some preliminary work in the beginning so you can understand and start acquiring the sentences the grammar point is used in from the very start. Here, a small example from my experience. I don't speak Korean, but I plan to start studying it in around 2 years. But because I'm impatient, I went through Hangul a few months back and looked at a manhwa directly afterwards. This isn't the exact sentence I found there, just an example. If you look at it like that, you don't know where to start. What is what? Where's the verb? If there is even one. What does what? And so on. After I unsuccessfully tried to look up parts of the sentence in a dictionary, I started reading through a short grammar guide. I skipped all the long-winded explanations and just tried to get some idea of what means what and read the example sentences. This turned the sentence into this. Even though I still don't understand the words, I can tell that the first word is the subject, the second is probably a place as it is marked with a specific particle that means something along the lines of to, and the last word is probably a verb and it is in the past tense. And the sentence means I went to school. Or rather, I school to went. Just this bit of reading, which took me probably around 40 minutes, helped me to understand more and made looking up the parts much easier. And this was a pretty easy sentence, but if you take something like this, where would you even start without any kind of knowledge? Before we start the section, keep in mind that we are working at full speed on our Migaku toolset, which already takes a ton of work. But at the same time, we are already working on the projects I'm going to show you. But due to all of our other projects, it may still take a while before we can release them. Or maybe by the time you're watching this video, they've already been released. In which case, you can find out more about them in the table of contents linked below. Okay, but now, what do we feel is the best way for immersion learners to study grammar? To get the confusion out of the way, I think I'll just call the type of grammar study we recommend grammar input. So here's an example of what grammar input looks like. First, you get a grammar point, followed by a short explanation of its meaning, and this followed by a bunch of examples. Each example gives a correct translation as well as a literal translation. So to summarize, the approach differs from the no grammar group in that we do recommend some grammar input in the beginning to make input as well as the acquisition of the language easier and faster. But it also differs from the other extreme, as we don't think memorization of conjugation charts, grammar exercises, or the memorization of other grammar rules is necessary. To make this type of grammar input easier, we are working on SRS flashcard decks exactly for this purpose. The decks will contain about 2000 to 2500 cards, and each card will be a one-target sentence. Depending on the language, 400 to 600 grammar points make up about 99.9% of the grammar used. So what are the other roughly 2000 cards for? They will cover the about 2000 most common words in the language, which, depending on the language, can cover about 80 to 85% of the words used. Furthermore, all the decks will be created as well as voiced by native speakers of the language. First, the deck will introduce a grammar point. This card is followed by a few cards that use the same grammar point in a new sentence, but also introduces a new word. So you have some opportunities to see the grammar point being used in context, while also learning the most important words alongside it. First, a text like this will look overwhelming, but after finishing the deck, you will know about 99% of the grammar used and 80 to 85% of the most common words, which makes this a lot more manageable. While this doesn't guarantee that you understand all the words and grammar point you've studied in your immersion, it will give you a solid base from which you can dive into full-on immersion learning.